Henry Every didn't set out to become a pirate legend. He began his life just like thousands of other sailors in the late 17th century, poor, expendable, and completely invisible to the empires that depended on his labor. Born in England, most likely in Devon, Every grew up near the sea. He learned a hard lesson early on. Ships promised work, but they never promised fairness. Sailors were often paid late, if they were paid at all. Officers were protected by their rank, but the crews were protected by nothing. Violence, constant hunger, and crushing debt were just accepted parts of life at sea. By the early 1690s, Henry Every had plenty of experience, but very little to show for it. He signed on to a Spanish privateering expedition, serving as first mate aboard a ship called the Charles II. On paper, it was legitimate work. A privateer was basically a licensed pirate, authorized to hunt French shipping. But in reality, the ship was a floating prison. The crew went unpaid for months. Supplies dwindled down to nothing. The missions they were promised never happened. The ship just sat idle in the harbor, while the officers lived comfortably ashore and the sailors slowly starved. Resentment began to grow, quietly at first. Sailors would talk at night, their voices low, their anger sharpening into a cold resolve. Every listened more than he spoke. He wasn't the loudest man on the ship, nor was he the most violent, but he was steady. He understood the ship, he understood the crew, and he understood the brutal math of survival. He also understood that waiting for justice from the people in power was a losing game. In 1694, their patience finally broke. While the captain was ashore, Every led a bloodless mutiny. There was no chaotic brawl, no desperate rush for control. It was clean and efficient. The officers were overpowered, and the ship was taken without any unnecessary violence. The crew backed Every not because he promised them chaos, but because he promised them control. He immediately renamed the ship the fancier sharp, almost playful name that disguised its lethal intent. That single moment marked the birth of something different. Unlike many pirates who just stumbled into an outlaw life out of desperation or a bad impulse, Every treated piracy as a calculated career change. He knew that survival depended on three things: speed, discipline, and restraint. The Fancy was already a fast ship, but he made it even faster. He lightened the ship, reorganized the rigging, and prioritized maneuverability over comfort. He armed it well, but avoided adding excess weight. His goal was simple: strike first and escape cleanly. Every also understood men. He divided shares fairly among the crew. He kept his promises, and he avoided unnecessary cruelty, not out of mercy, but because he knew cruelty invited revenge. A living witness, he believed, could carry fear much farther than a dead body. Reputation, he knew, was worth more than brute force. Within just a few weeks, the Fancy became something else entirely. It was no longer a privateer, no longer a mutineer's refuge. It was a purpose-built pirate ship, commanded by a man who saw piracy not as a rebellion, but as a business opportunity. Every set a course for the Indian Ocean, a decision that revealed the true scale of his ambition. Most pirates at the time lingered in the Caribbean, feeding on the familiar trade routes, but Every was aiming higher. He understood that the greatest wealth on the planet wasn't moving between Europe and the Americas. It was moving between India, Arabia, and Africa. The Mughal Empire dominated this world, and its massive treasure fleets carried amounts of gold and silver beyond imagination. Reaching those waters was incredibly dangerous. European navies patrolled the routes aggressively. Vicious storms could destroy unprepared ships. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, but the Fancy was built for endurance. Every avoided ports where authorities might ask too many questions. He replenished his supplies carefully, traded selectively, and always stayed mobile. Along the way, he recruited other pirate crews, forming loose alliances without ever binding himself to them. He didn't want to rule over other pirates. He just wanted to use them. Every knew that coordination increased the odds of success, but that a strict hierarchy created a vulnerability. So he remained independent and adaptable. As the Fancy crossed into the Indian Ocean, the crew began to understand the scale of what they were attempting. This wasn't just opportunistic theft. This was a long game, aimed at a single, overwhelming payoff. Every made his intentions crystal clear to his men. One decisive strike, a prize big enough to let them all disappear forever. That promise was everything. Most pirates died poor, hunted down, or betrayed by their own crew. Every offered them something much rarer: an exit strategy. He drilled his crew relentlessly. Boarding procedures were rehearsed over and over. Weapons were maintained obsessively. Absolute silence was enforced during an approach. He demanded discipline not through fear, but through logic. Every man understood that a single mistake meant death for them all. Precision, on the other hand, meant freedom. The fancy earned a few early successes, capturing smaller vessels to fund the long journey and, more importantly, to gather intelligence. Every questioned his prisoners carefully, learning about shipping schedules, fleet movements, and rumors. Piece by piece, a picture began to form. The great Mughal treasure fleet sailed annually, returning from Mecca laden with unimaginable wealth. It was guarded, of course, but it was also vulnerable during certain stretches of its route. And so, Henry Every waited. Patience was his greatest weapon. He didn't rush toward the first prize that appeared on the horizon. He allowed other, more reckless pirates to reveal themselves, to draw the attention of the navies, and to thin out the defenses. He remained a shadow, moving quietly, letting the pressure and expectation build somewhere else. By the time the fancy positioned itself near the Mughal fleet's path, Every was ready. The crew was seasoned. The ship was perfectly tuned. They were no longer just sailors who had mutinied against neglect. They were predators, patiently targeting the richest prey ever to sail the seas. And the world had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. For centuries, the Indian Ocean wasn't a lawless sea. It was a place of immense order, wealth, and tradition. Trade moved like clockwork, empires depended on its rhythms, and pilgrims traveled safely under the protection of powerful rulers. Treasure was moved openly, guarded by authority, because no one had ever successfully challenged that authority, until one man decided to try. His name was Henry Every, and he was about to commit an act so audacious it would shake the world. Our story begins with the Mughal Empire, one of the richest and most powerful on earth. Every year, massive treasure fleets sailed from the bustling port of Mocha, returning to India. These ships were laden not just with pilgrims returning from Mecca, but with nobles, merchants, and a staggering amount of gold, silver, jewels, and coin. It was a floating symbol of Mughal power, and at the heart of this fleet was its crown jewel, the Ganj-i-Sawai, meaning exceeding treasure. This wasn't just any ship. It was a colossal vessel, armed with over 60 cannons, and belonged directly to the Mughal emperor himself. It was more than just rich. It was politically untouchable. Attacking it was an act of war, an unthinkable crime against an empire. And that was exactly why Henry Every made it his target. He understood that the greatest rewards often lie behind the greatest risks. But ambition alone couldn't capture a prize like this. The Mughal fleet was well protected, traveled in convoys, and sailed routes known to every major navy. Every needed more than just courage. He needed impeccable timing, solid intelligence, and allies he could trust for a single, critical moment. So, he began his hunt, not with a roar, but with a whisper. For months, his ship, the Fancy, stalked the region. Every avoided fights, conserving his strength and, more importantly, his secrecy. He became a ghost, listening more than he acted. He gathered tiny fragments of information from captured sailors, local traders, and even rival pirates. Slowly, a picture formed. The Mughal ships were powerful, yes, but their strength was also their weakness. They relied on their imposing size and the authority they represented, not on tactical flexibility. Their coordination was imperfect. Every saw a crack in the armor of invincibility. Next, he needed a crew. But he knew pirates distrusted authority as much as any navy captain, so he didn't build a fleet. He formed a temporary coalition. He approached other pirate captains, not as a commander giving orders, but as a coordinator making a promise. If they found the fleet, they would attack together. If they took the treasure, it would be divided fairly. No long-term commitments, no hierarchy, just a shared goal for one spectacular moment. This quiet, transactional leadership style was brilliant. It kept the fragile egos and natural distrust among the pirates from shattering the plan before it could even begin. Finally, the moment arrived. The Mughal fleet appeared on the horizon. It didn't look like prey. It looked like an unstoppable force of nature. Towering hulls, armed escorts, and imperial flags that screamed "turn back." Many pirates would have hesitated. He knew he couldn't take on the Ganj-i-Sawai head-on. Not at first. He needed to shatter their confidence. So, his first target wasn't the main prize, but a smaller escort vessel sailing ahead, the Fatih Mohammed. The pirates moved with blinding speed, closing the distance before the escorts could fully organize a defense. The attack was brutal and efficient. Cannon fire tore through masts, disabling the ship. Boarding parties followed immediately. Within minutes, the escort vessel was overwhelmed and captured. The effect was instantaneous. Panic rippled through the Mughal fleet. Authority, once cracked, doesn't heal easily. The unthinkable had just happened, and suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. Now, all eyes turned to the Ganj-i-Sawai. The massive ship tried to fight back, unleashing a broadside. But then, fate intervened in the most dramatic way possible. One of the Ganj-i-Sawai's own massive cannons exploded on its deck. The blast killed crewmen, started fires, and sowed absolute chaos. Smoke filled the air, and the ship's command structure faltered. In an instant, the symbol of imperial invincibility looked vulnerable, mortal. Henry Every seized the moment. The Fancy closed in with terrifying speed. Grappling hooks flew through the air, biting into the Ganj-i-Sawai's wooden hull. Pirates, screaming with adrenaline, poured over the rails. What followed wasn't a clean naval battle. It was a desperate, violent, and chaotic struggle. The Mughal ship was a floating fortress, and its crew and soldiers resisted fiercely. Every's pirates fought room by room, deck by deck, their victory fueled by surprise, relentless pressure, and sheer numbers. The battle raged for hours, but when the smoke finally cleared and the fighting stopped, the unthinkable had happened. The personal ship of the Mughal emperor had fallen to a small band of pirates, and the treasure aboard, it defied belief. It was the stuff of legends, chests overflowing with gold and silver coins from across the world, heaps of uncut diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, lustrous pearls, and fine silks. It was the accumulated wealth of an empire, all in one place. It remains the largest pirate haul ever recorded, dwarfing anything taken before or since. For the crew of the Fancy, this was more than just a victory. It was a transformation. They were no longer just sailors or outlaws. They were now among the richest men in the world. But Every's genius didn't end with the battle. He knew that the greatest danger often comes right after success. Greed, drunkenness, and infighting could tear them apart. He enforced strict order. The loot was brought to a central point, meticulously catalogued, and every single share was counted out. Discipline was absolute. As soon as the treasure was divided, the pirate coalition dissolved. They scattered to the winds. This wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Every pointed the Fancy away from the scene of the crime and vanished into the vastness of the ocean, moving faster than the news of his deed could travel. And behind him, the world reeled. The Mughal Empire was incandescent with rage. Pilgrims had been attacked, its authority publicly humiliated on a global stage. The emperor demanded that the European powers, especially the English, hunt Every down and answer for the crime. The British East India Company, fearing the collapse of all its trade in the region, panicked. For the very first time, an act of piracy threatened to destabilize international politics on a massive scale. A global manhunt was launched, and at the center of this storm was Henry Every, a man who had struck once, perfectly, a man who became known as the arch-pirate and the king of pirates. Aboard the Fancy, sailing away with the treasure beyond imagination, the promise Every had made to his crew was now real. They had enough wealth to disappear, to buy new lives, to end the game entirely on their own terms. The heist was complete. The world would search for him, but Henry Every, the man who pulled off the crime of the century, simply vanished from history, his ultimate fate remaining one of the greatest mysteries of the golden age of piracy. Escape was always the most dangerous part. Every pirate knew that. A heist could succeed on surprise and sheer nerve, but surviving afterward, that took discipline, especially when temptation was staring you right in the face. The pirate ship Fancy now held more wealth than most men could imagine. That treasure was both their shield and their curse. It could buy them freedom, but only if it didn't tear the crew apart before they even made it to shore. Henry Every moved fast. He refused to linger near the Indian coast, knowing that news of their attack would travel faster than his ship. He knew imperial anger would soon harden into a relentless pursuit. The Fancy constantly changed course, avoiding busy ports, slipping through unpatrolled waters, trying to become just another shadow on the vast ocean. Every didn't take the obvious route back to Europe. Instead, he used misdirection, sailing routes that would confuse any reports and delay the inevitable chase. But inside the ship, a different kind of storm was brewing. Men who had lived their lives on scraps now slept beside chests overflowing with gold. Arguments broke out over shares, over imagined insults, over what to do next. Some wanted to sail straight back to England and live like kings. Others, emboldened by their massive success, wanted to keep piracy. A few just wanted to jump ship at the next port and disappear. Every shut that down, and he shut it down fast. He gathered the crew and reminded them of the agreement they all made: one strike, then freedom. Anyone who threatened that promise was a threat to everyone on board. Discipline tightened, not through cruelty, but through cold, hard certainty. The rules hadn't changed just because they were rich. In fact, now, the rules mattered more than ever. Every understood something else, something deeper. The greatest enemy of a pirate wasn't a navy, but time. The longer they stayed together as a single crew, the greater the chance of betrayal, exposure, or a fatal mistake. So, he began to dismantle his own command. Instead of leading the Fancy as a long-term pirate operation, he turned it into a vehicle for dispersal. At carefully chosen safe points along their journey, he allowed small groups of men to leave with their shares. They would slip into ports under fake names and vanish into the crowds. Each departure reduced the risk for those who remained. Each disappearance made the trail colder and harder for anyone to follow. This wasn't generosity, it was brilliant strategy. Meanwhile, the world they had left behind was erupting. News of the attack hit India first, then spread like wildfire. The Mughal Emperor was furious, not just about the lost treasure, but about the sheer humiliation to his imperial authority. European trading posts were threatened. English merchants were arrested in retaliation. The powerful British East India Company faced a crisis that could have destroyed its entire operation in the region. For the first time, an act of piracy was forcing international diplomacy. Governments panicked. The British Crown issued proclamations. Huge rewards were offered for their capture. A global manhunt began, not just for a band of pirates, but for the stability of global trade itself. And just like that, Henry Every became the most wanted man in the world. But Every had anticipated this. By the time official descriptions of him and his crew were circulating, they were already outdated. Reports conflicted wildly. Some said the Fancy had sailed east. Others swore it was headed west. Some claimed Every was already dead. Others insisted he'd captured a new ship. This confusion wasn't an accident. It was the result of his careful planning, the fog of misdirection he had created. At some point, the Fancy reached the Caribbean. There, Every made his final, calculated move. He sold the ship, not in a blaze of glory or defiance, but quietly, like a man getting rid of a tool he no longer needed. The Fancy, the fastest, most successful pirate ship of its time, didn't end its career in a naval battle. It simply became irrelevant. That act was Every's true escape. Ships can be hunted, crews can be tracked, but a man with a pocket full of gold and a world full of patience, he can simply vanish. After that, the story fractures into 1,000 pieces. Some of his crew members were eventually caught. A few were tried and executed. Others managed to live out their lives quietly, spending their incredible wealth with extreme caution. But Henry Every himself, he slipped into the fog of history. There was no confirmed arrest, no public execution. Rumors multiplied to fill the void left by his disappearance. Some said he returned to England and lived as a country gentleman under a false name, rich but forever looking over his shoulder. Others claimed he was betrayed by his own men and died a penniless beggar, cheated out of his fortune. A few insisted he escaped to a pirate haven in Madagascar or Ireland, living out his days far beyond the reach of any law. Each story tells you more about the hopes and fears of the people telling it than it does about Every himself. But none could ever be proven. Ultimately, what mattered wasn't where he went, but that he got away at all. Henry Every did what almost no other pirate in history ever managed. He didn't seek fame, he didn't seek to build an empire, and he didn't care about his legacy. He sought one single, perfect victory, and then he sought absence. His silence after the heist was his masterpiece. Legends require an ending, a story to be told and retold, but survival requires disappearing completely. Behind him, the world of piracy changed forever. The sheer scale of his theft forced governments to take the threat seriously. Laws were tightened, naval patrols were increased. The blurry line between a government-sanctioned privateer and an outlaw pirate became sharp and clear. The romantic tolerance that sometimes surrounded pirates evaporated. The world that Every escaped from became a much less forgiving place for those who followed him. And yet, the idea he represented endured. Every proved that piracy didn't have to be a desperate, endless struggle. It could be strategic, finite, and devastatingly effective. He showed the world that a pirate's greatest weapon wasn't his cannon or his cruelty, but his timing. Strike once, strike perfectly, and get out before the world has a chance to adapt. The irony is sharp. By the time his name became the stuff of legend, he was already long gone. By the time the world started building myths around him, he had made sure there would never be an ending to his story. No final chapter to confirm or deny any of it. Henry Every didn't die in a glorious battle. He didn't stand trial for his crimes. He didn't fade away into obscurity. He simply stepped out of the story at its absolute peak. And that, more than all the gold and all the violence, is what made him the most dangerous pirate of them all. The world Henry Every escaped did not recover quietly. The shock of the heist lingered long after the fancy vanished from the horizon. A phantom ship carrying an emperor's ransom. 4 empires built on the assumption of absolute control. The raid was not merely a crime, it was a fracture in reality itself. If one pirate crew could strike the Mughal Empire at its richest point and simply walk away, then no trade route, no treasure fleet, no colonial outpost was truly safe. The response was immediate and severe. The Mughal court viewed the attack as a direct and unbearable insult, not just to imperial wealth, but to imperial authority. In a heartbeat, English trading posts were surrounded. Merchants, who just days before were conducting business, found themselves imprisoned. Threats of expulsion loomed, a death sentence for the British East India Company, whose entire business, whose very existence, depended on Mughal goodwill. All of it was suddenly on the brink of disaster, all because of a single pirate. In London, panic followed cold calculation. For decades, piracy had been a dirty little secret, a tool sometimes tolerated, sometimes even encouraged, when it served national interests or remained small enough to ignore. It was a problem for the Spanish, or the French, or someone else. Henry Every changed that calculus overnight. He wasn't just an inconvenience, he was a catastrophic liability. For the first time, an act of piracy threatened to shatter international diplomacy and derail the entire engine of commercial survival for the burgeoning British Empire. So, the crown moved. Rewards were posted for Every's capture, dead or alive. It was a sum that could make a king out of a commoner. Orders were dispatched to governors across the colonies, from the Caribbean to North America. Captains were instructed to search any suspicious ship, interrogate sailors, and watch the ports for men spending unusual amounts of money. It was one of the first truly global manhunts in history, a net cast across the entire known world. And yet, the hunt failed. Every, it seems, had anticipated this phase as carefully as he had planned the heist itself. His genius wasn't just in the attack, but in the escape. By dismantling his crew early, scattering them across continents with their pockets full of gold and jewels, he ensured that no single capture could unravel the whole conspiracy. By abandoning the fancy, his famous and now infamous ship, he erased the most obvious thread for authorities to pull. Most importantly, by choosing silence, by melting back into the world, he denied them the satisfaction of closure. The frustration for the authorities was immense. Rumors were chased across oceans, costing fortunes and leading to dead ends. Pamphlets, the social media of the day, printed exaggerated descriptions until Henry Every became less a man and more a spectre. He was tall, he was short, he had a scar, he was unblemished, he was everywhere and nowhere. The more the manhunt dragged on, the more his very absence undermined the authority of those who hunted him. He was a ghost they couldn't exorcise, and in that absence, a legend formed. Stories spread like wildfire through the ports and taverns of the world. Some painted Every as a pirate king, living in secret luxury on a remote island, ruling a hidden kingdom from the shadows. Others portrayed him as a tragic figure, betrayed by his own greedy crew and reduced to a life of poverty, a lonely wanderer haunted by his great success. Plays were written about him. He became a blank canvas, a symbol onto which the public projected all their fears and fantasies of freedom, rebellion, and escape. But the truth was likely far less dramatic and far more dangerous for the powers that be. If Every managed to live quietly, anonymously, blending back into society unseen, then he represented a nightmare for the concept of power itself. He was living proof that someone could defy the world's mightiest empires, take everything they held dear, and simply get away with it. That possibility terrified governments more than any flamboyant, attention-seeking outlaw ever could. The flamboyant outlaw could be caught and made an example of. The invisible man could not. Other pirates certainly took notice. Crews dreamed of that one perfect strike, the single heist that would set them up for life. But most lacked the critical ingredients of every success: the patience, the discipline, or the restraint to replicate his model. They chased wealth repeatedly instead of decisively. They stayed in the game too long. They drew too much attention. What Henry Every had achieved, it turned out, was not a formula that could be reproduced at scale. Ironically, his singular success helped close the door behind him. In the wake of the manhunt, naval patrols increased permanently. Cooperation between rival empires, once unthinkable, improved out of shared necessity. The ports of the world grew smaller, tighter, and far less tolerant of suspicious sailors with heavy pockets. Piracy didn't end overnight, but its character changed forever. The era of the clean escape, the idea of sailing off into the sunset with the treasure, began to fade. The odds tilted decisively toward capture or death. In a way, Henry Every had slipped through a closing window at the last possible moment. And still, the years went by. No deathbed confession was ever recorded. No verified sighting ever convinced the authorities. That gaping uncertainty became the final insult. They could punish other captured pirates, parade them in chains through the streets, hang them from gibbets as a gruesome warning to others. But they could not punish Henry Every, and most infuriatingly, he had denied them control of the narrative. His story had no official ending, and that allowed it to endure longer and stronger than most. In their frantic attempts to erase him, they only amplified his legend. Decades passed, new pirates rose and fell. Names like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts would later dominate the golden age of piracy, drawing fire and fame in equal measure. But even they, the most notorious of their time, would meet violent, well-documented ends. Every remained the outlier, the man who broke the pattern. He did not seem to seek immortality, yet he achieved it through his complete and total absence. The world eventually adjusted around the wound he left behind, but something fundamental had shifted deep within the consciousness of empire. The powerful now understood that even the strongest systems had seams, weak points that could be exploited by someone patient, clever, and ruthless enough to find them. Henry Every had not just stolen gold. What remains after Henry Every is not a trail, but a vacuum. No grave, no scaffold, no final confession. History closes in on him from all sides and finds nothing solid to hold. And in that emptiness, his story becomes something more than a pirate tale. It becomes a boundary marker. The point where one era quietly ends and another begins. Piracy did not die with Henry Every, but it was never the same again. Before him, piracy was tolerated when it was useful, and ignored when it was inconvenient. After him, it became a threat to global order. Governments no longer saw pirates as scattered criminals. They saw them as destabilizing forces capable of igniting diplomatic crises. The raid on the Mughal treasure fleet proved that a single, well-planned strike could ripple across continents, damage economies, and humiliate empires. That lesson was never forgotten. Information sharing between rival powers increased. Ports that once looked the other way began demanding papers, explanations, loyalty. The sea grew less forgiving, not because pirates disappeared, but because the margin for error vanished. Henry Every had slipped through a closing door. The irony is that later pirates became more famous precisely because they failed where Every succeeded. Blackbeard's theatrical terror, Bartholomew Roberts' disciplined empire. Charles Vane's defiance, all of them burned brighter and died louder. Their endings satisfied authority. His legend survived because it denied resolution. Writers and storytellers seized on that absence. In the decades that followed, Every appeared in plays and pamphlets as a romantic hero, a cautionary tale, a folk devil, a phantom king. Each version said more about the fears of the age than about the man himself. He became shorthand for the idea that someone could beat the system completely, and that possibility haunted those who benefited from the system. Yet stripped of myth, his achievement remained stark and rare. He did not dominate the seas for years. He did not amass power through endless violence. He did not chase notoriety. He planned patiently, struck once, and dismantled his own operation before success could turn into exposure. In a world built on repetition and habit, Henry Every won by refusing to repeat himself. That restraint was his greatest strength. It also explains why his model was never truly copied. Piracy feeds on momentum and the belief that the next prize is always just ahead. Walking away requires a discipline few possess. Most pirates stayed too long. Every did not. Somewhere, he lived out his days as an ordinary man, or perhaps he did not live long at all. History cannot say. But the fact that it cannot say is the point. He escaped not just capture, but definition. He denied the world a neat ending. In doing so, he became something more unsettling than a legend, a reminder that systems fail at their edges, that power assumes continuity where none is guaranteed, that the greatest disruption is sometimes a single, perfect act, followed by silence. The fancy is gone, its planks rotted, its sails repurposed, its name dissolved into rumor, the gold it carried scattered into countless lives, spent, lost, hidden, diluted. Nothing tangible remains, except the idea that once, briefly, a man saw the entire board, played one flawless move, and left before the game could change. That was Henry Every's true legacy. Not the biggest pirate heist ever recorded, but the quiet proof that even empires can be robbed, and that sometimes the most powerful ending is simply not being there when the world comes looking. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories that slip through the cracks of history.